I have never, ever had a kid in my office say, my parents just listen too much. Never. They always say my parents talk too much. And my advice for parents now, such as it is listen.
Welcome to Tilt Parenting, a podcast featuring interviews and conversations aimed at inspiring, informing, and supporting parents raising differently wired kids. I'm your host, Debbie Reber. My guest this week is Dr. Madeline Levine, a psychologist with over 40 years of experience as a clinician, consultant, educator, and author. Madeline is also the co-founder of Challenge Success, a school reform nonprofit affiliated with the Stanford Graduate School of Education, and is a highly sought-after consultant, lecturer, and speaker on all issues related to parenting. You may be familiar with some of Madeline's books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Price of Privilege, which explores the reasons why teenagers from affluent families are experiencing epidemic rates of emotional problems. And then her follow-up book, Teach Your Children Well, tackles our current narrow definition of success. But her brand new book, and what we're going to be talking about today, is called Ready or Not, Preparing Our Kids to Thrive in an Uncertain and Rapidly Changing World. And I have to say, I think that Ready or Not is really the perfect book for what we're collectively experiencing right now. In our conversation, we talk about the ideas behind her book, what Madeline sees as the lessons and gifts of the pandemic, why she thinks hope and optimism are the ultimate life skills, and more. Just like Madeline's book, this was a thought-provoking conversation for me. I hope you get a lot out of it. And as always, thank you so much for being part of this Tilt Parenting revolution. If you want to stay in the loop about important news, new classes, and special live events, sign up at tiltparenting.com. Thanks so much, and now here is my conversation with Madeline. Hello, Madeline. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
I'm excited to have this conversation with you. We haven't done a podcast before, but we know each other. We've been in conversation. We've had lots of interesting conversations, along with a lot of other folks, about the issues we're going to talk about today.
Right. I have to tell you, Deb, that I did really a thorough look at the work you've done, which, I sort of know you from chatting, but I am stunned by the amount of work that went into the podcast, but also Tilt Parenting. And I really didn't have any idea how far-reaching and important it was. So wow. That was a pleasure to find out.
Thank you so much. That means so much to me. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, you have such an incredible body of work, and, you've written a number of really big books. You wrote an incredible book, The Price of Privilege. I think that was probably 2008, 2009, where you really pulled back the curtain on the ways in which growing up privileged was actually resulting in a slew of emotional problems and hurting kids' healthy development. And you have another amazing book called Teach Your Children Well, where you talk about the short-sighted definition of success. And now you have this incredible book, which is so timely, that we're going to be talking about today. It's called Ready or Not, Preparing Our Kids to Thrive in an Uncertain and Rapidly Changing World. So I would love if you could just tell us about that book and why you wrote it in the first place.
So it's kind of an interesting story. I wrote it for two reasons. The first one probably was my sense that while the other books I had written were very popular, and there's a cadre of us, the people in our group, but other people as well, going out around the country with the same message, which is, pull back a little bit. Performance is not everything. There's a whole bunch of other things that matter for kids to have good lives. And while individually I was feeling like I was making progress, the reality was that rates of mental illness did not go down over the last 12 years and 13 years now. As a matter of fact, they went up. And so I think part of it came out of a feeling of either, well, I'm done, that's the best I can do. And it hasn't made a profound change. And also feeling like people were still eager to find out how they could do things differently and why they should do things differently. Nobody wants to feel that their kid is an experiment. So at the end of the day, I was still hearing, well, going to Brown can't hurt, or Harvard sends all of its people into high-paying jobs. And I knew, because I had friends in business and in the military, that there was really a shift in who was being hired. So I wanted to expand what I had to say from just, hey, look, the rates of anxiety and depression are unacceptable, and they're partly a result of the kind of culture we've set up. But now I had a lot of evidence that it wasn't only bad in childhood, it continued to be a problem because it wasn't good preparation for the kinds of jobs that these exact same people were hoping to get for their children. Mm-hmm. So that was the reason. It's like my last stab at, can we change the paradigm? The book came out 3 weeks before lockdown. So I wasn't prescient. I had no idea, like everybody else, that this was about to happen. So, a lot of people assume that it started during COVID. It didn't. It was published 3 weeks before COVID, which meant that I didn't have a book to, everything got canceled around the publication of the book. But it was very timely, as you say, in terms of the kinds of things people were going to need. Not at the very beginning. At the very beginning, you just had to survive. You just had to figure out how you were going to live your next day, because nobody knew. But, as people adjusted to some degree, I think there was more interest in, well, what else? What can I use this time for? I've got more time. What can I use it for? And I think the book answers that.
Well, and also I feel like we spent the past now year and a half almost getting a really close-up view of what anxiety looks like and experiencing it as adults, many of us for the first time. And so it is just, it's just to me such an interesting time in terms of maybe this collective growth and maybe a deeper understanding of how pervasive and challenging anxiety and depression and other mental illnesses can be.
So your audience can't see, I have a big smile on my face because I'm thinking, if this is the first time you've had anxiety, you're lucky, because I'm somebody who's quite anxious, and there's a difference between having anxiety and having an anxiety disorder. And I think part of what happened here is that, if you were a little anxious, you became really anxious. If you were a little dysphoric, a little depressed, you became, wherever your cracks were in this period of time, they were heightened because the reality was nobody knew what to do. And it was interesting for me, Deb, in the sense that I was, I must have given 30, 40 talks, and everybody was looking for answers. And nobody really had answers, including experts, air quotes, because we'd never been through it before. So, we had a lot of best practices around challenge and stuff like that. But the length of this, the life or death of this, the fact that there was no celebration, that we had defeated an enemy, there was only divisiveness in the country. So, yeah, it felt to me like we were thrown into the deep end of the pool without water wings or swimming lessons. So it was a hard time for everybody.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, so you have a revised edition of the book, which we're recording this at the end of May, but as listeners hear it, the book should be available or will be within a week or two. So can you tell us, were there some bigger changes that you wanted to make as you went through the book based on what we've been through?
Not really. So I needed to write kind of a prologue and redo parts of the book because to ignore what we had just gone through seemed impossible to me. But the basics of how do you promote resilience. What goes into resilience? I listened to you and Michelle Borba recently. We're all talking about the same thing, which is, it's great. Your kid gets into Brown or whatever it is. That's great if that's where that kid belongs. But the reality in life is there's an entirely different skill set that is protective, both of parents and children, by the way. Everybody thinks I'm a child expert, and that's my training. But I really think I write to parents because, if we're not okay, our kids are not okay. And we all have different kids. I know your area of expertise, but everybody has different kids, and not necessarily neurodiverse, but different. And you have to make all kinds of adjustments to that. And so this one-size-fits-all notion of success, it's outdated, period. And we've just lived through a period of time where people needed flexibility, where people needed curiosity. And if you were low on those skills, you had a really hard time, especially young mothers with younger children who had to work and be a teacher. And it was really, I think, close to an impossible task if you stuck with your old metrics. The bed's not made, the dinner's not cooked, the kid didn't get a good enough grade. You stuck with those metrics, you were in for a very bad time. The prologue talks a little bit about, I really hope we've all learned something through this about what's important and what's not important. And the other thing I want to say about it is I also think there was a huge opportunity. And it's hard to talk about that in terms of the tragedy that it was. But I was just talking to my publicist, and they were saying, how are you positioning this as it goes out again? And they were doing all the things about high rates of mental illness and deaths of despair, opioid death, all the things that were wrong. And I think those things need to be acknowledged. But I also think it was an enormous opportunity for people to rethink the paradigms we are so attached to. I'll bet you've decided to make some changes in your life. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, 100%, including a lot more baking. But beyond that, yes, tons of changes. Yeah. For sure.
Your baking is as notable as anything any of us have done. It's like sometimes I look at your pictures just because it looks delicious, and it's like one day I'll get to have some of that stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. And I am not going to spend every week of my life on an airplane again, period. And I think thinking about what matters and how we allocate time has become incredible. I'm a lot older than you are. So it's like that has become incredibly important. So when they were doing all this thing about, all the increases in bad stuff, I said, I think we also have to attend to the fact that people had an opportunity to think more about how they want to live their lives. I don't believe we're going back to normal. I think, my daughter-in-laws who work in tech, they'll be on some hybrid model. Mm-hmm. Everything I know is on some kind of changed model. And we're going to have to adapt to that. It's not going to be the same as it was before. And I think the opportunity to think about what matters was a great opportunity. And I think one of the questions is, how do you maintain that going forward?
Yeah, a lot of the conversations I've had for the podcast for this summer season have been surrounding education too, and just how this has given us an opportunity to really reflect on the different ways that kids learn and can express their, abilities and competencies. And I hope that it shook things up enough that there's going to be more flexibility or more room for accommodations in the classroom to support different kinds of learners.
Right. And about my project, Challenge Success at Stanford. So, I co-founded that. That stuff is very, very important to me because I started out as a teacher long before I was a psychologist. And it made no sense to me when I was 27 the way I worked inner city, and there were lots of kids with all kinds of issues and one rigid curriculum, and nobody learned anything. And that was the hardest job I ever had, was teaching. And the degree of respect I believe that teachers deserve is not in evidence as far as I'm concerned. I don't like words like heroes, that's their job. But being forced to teach in this rather narrow range, and, or you may not, I have 3 sons, and they were incredibly different. My first son was the straight A student athlete. School worked great for him. And my middle kid was extremely creative, and school didn't work as well for him. And my third son was totally hands-on with some learning differences, and it really sucked for him. So, it was a living lesson in, okay, maybe it works for a third of kids. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's small. And there were plenty of kids, by the way, which I suspect who did fine, who did better on distance learning. Mm-hmm. So I think there's so much to rethink in what we think the goal of education is, and how many kids have been absolutely hobbled by the way education does not meet them where they are. Mm-hmm. So Challenge Success is working on that. Lots of organizations are working on rethinking that. I just have one funny story. I said, my middle son was very creative, and I never went up to school for my kids. It was like, you can handle it, whatever it was. But he was in middle school, and he wrote a story. My mother, unfortunately, has had Alzheimer's for about 15 years now. And he wrote this story about an elderly couple, and the man thought his wife was Marilyn Monroe. And it was just so sweet and embedded in my family. Anyway, he got a lousy grade on it. And the teacher wrote on it, Marilyn Monroe was not alive when your grandmother was alive. And it's the only time I ever went up to school, because it so missed the boat on the creativity and the curiosity and thinking about what that's like for a child on an ongoing basis, not just this one story that I'm telling you almost 20 years later, but on a daily basis. So that needs to change, and it needs to change radically, not, and I'm going to sound cynical because I've been doing this for a while. I'm not interested in putting SEL in a classroom once a week for an hour. That is not the solution to this. Even with SEL, it needs to be cross-curriculum. It needs to be embedded in culture. And that's the way we need to be thinking. We need to be thinking as revolutionaries, as radicals about how to change school. Okay, I was off on my school.
No, I love the way you think. And listeners also, I always have links on the show notes page for each episode. So I'll make sure that you guys can check out the Challenge Success program, because there's a lot of good resources and research and content there. No, I love that. You can go on a rant like that anytime. It wasn't a rant, but I appreciated everything you said.
Thanks.
We'll be right back after this quick break. During this month of planning and organization for big transitions, rhythms and routines have been absolutely essential for our physical and emotional well-being. So Green Chef nights are reliably and predictably a good night. We know the ingredients will be fresh and prepped, the instructions easy to follow, and the meal delicious. We're all still talking about last week's turkey tacos with mango chimichurri sauce, refried beans, and Monterey Jack cheese. Green Chef contributes to a healthy lifestyle with easy and delicious menus like fresh seasonal salads and green bowls. And with over 80 weekly meal and market options, plus rotating options to suit a variety of lifestyles, whether Mediterranean, plant-based, calorie-smart, keto, protein-packed, gluten-free, there are always plenty of options to choose from. Whatever you select, you'll get farm-fresh ingredients, organic whole fruits and veggies, and premium proteins, all delivered straight to your door. I love those 4 words. Straight to my door. Oh, and one more thing I love about Green Chef, they have an app, which means it's easy to manage meal preferences and delivery from your phone if you want to. And I, for one, want to. I am in that mode where I'm making the most of little moments like waiting in line at the pharmacy or for the F train to pull into the station to tackle all of those to-dos. So the convenience of an app is key for me. Green Chef has a special offer for Tilt listeners. Go to greenchef.com/tilt50 and use code TILT50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months when you use the code TILT50 at greenchef.com/tilt50. Maybe I've watched too many seasons of The Amazing Race, but every time I have to go somewhere on the subway, I treat it like a competition. It's all about making the right gut decisions about which route will get me there the fastest. Sometimes those decisions get me where I'm going early, and other times my gambles don't really pay off. Probiotics can't help with most gut decisions, but if your gut needs a little support, Ritual has your back. Their Symbiotic Plus, a 3-in-1 supplement, has clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. I've been using Symbiotic Plus for about 6 months now, and it's become a core part of my morning routine. I take the mini capsule every morning while making my way through my inbox, whether I'm at home or I'm on the road, because it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And the capsule itself is delayed released, which helps it survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon, and that's exactly where we want it to go. Ritual invested in a study modeling the human colon, which showed that Symbiotic Plus significantly increased microbial diversity and the growth of beneficial bacteria. There's no more shame in your gut game. Symbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide your insides. Get 25% off your first month for a limited time at ritual.com/tilt. Start Ritual or add Symbiotic Plus to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/tilt for 25% off. So one of the things that you do is you outline what you see as the key traits for dealing with a tumultuous future, including adaptability, mental agility, curiosity, collaboration, tolerance for failure, resilience, and optimism. So as I read that list, I think about the listeners. Many of our kids have more, I would say they're more in the fixed mindset camp than the growth mindset camp. And I just would love to hear your thoughts on how possible it is to help these kids who might be more rigid thinkers to become more agile and adaptable.
I'll tell you, if I write again, it will be the 7 myths of parenting. And that's one of them, that you can't teach these things. And I don't know where this got started, this idea that you were either curious or not, you were either creative or not. So, I'm very interested in epigenetics, right? Epigenetics is that intersection of what you came into the world with your genetics and your environment. Do I think that all 3 of my kids I don't think they were all 3 equally came into the world with creativity. They had different levels of it. Kids have different levels of everything. But the environment at the end of the day is what, for all of us, expresses our genetics or not. We all have within us the possibility of anxiety, the possibility of depression, maybe the possibility of substance abuse or the genetic pool is really big, and an awful lot depends on the environment. So the idea that you can't teach creativity or you can't teach self-regulation, we try to teach self-regulation all the time, right? With varying degrees of success. Just because we know each other. I have a 2-year-old granddaughter, and I had her here for the week for 4 nights, my husband and I. And it's the first time I've had her for a period of time, and it was fabulous. She's fabulous. She also had a temper tantrum that looked like it came out of The Exorcist to me. I mean, out of her mind, screaming and yelling and throwing. And I was looking at that. And in reference to your question right now, I know that child who was terrifying in that moment will grow up to not do that. How? Because she's been taught a degree of, she's been taught over time and developmentally appropriately how to control herself. So this idea, this fixed mind idea that, we'd all be still trying to parent, screaming, yelling, exorcist babies, and we're not. So most of our kids learn, some of your listeners probably have kids who are more difficult to teach self-regulation to. Again, I think we ask so much of parents, the flexibility, the willingness to tolerate outbursts, the getting rid of all the shoulds. My child should do this at this, should do that at this point. That's not true for any kid or many kids, but it's certainly not true for neurodiverse children. But everybody who's listening had a child who once couldn't walk, and they crawled. And then they started to learn how to walk. They stood up, they fell down. We didn't criticize them for falling down. We didn't say she's never going to learn to walk. We knew we had to ride the amount of time it took for that particular child to walk. Mm-hmm. In my house, my first kid walked at 9 months, which we thought was great at the time. Wasn't so great. He had zero judgment and he was running around. So I think we have pictures of the way in which we intuitively know that children need a period of time, that they develop differently, that we have to be okay with that we have to keep whatever anxiety we might have in check as best we can with some support around us. But children absolutely change. Mm-hmm. And part of it has to do, so I'm hoping maybe this is of interest to your audience. I think in general, we spend way too much time looking at deficits and nowhere near enough time on kids' strengths. And I'm a basketball fan. They say you go to your right means go to your strong side. That's life. You go to your strong side. And the calls that not anymore, because I think people know my response, that I get, I'd like to talk to you about my child. What's with your child? Well, she's got 4 A's and a C. And I know that call is not about the 4 A's. Mm-hmm. It's about the C. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I think in my own life, and I always ask people to do this, think in your own life. What were your strengths? What were your weaknesses? I was a very good English student. I wrote well. I was a very mediocre math student. Guess what? I'm not a math teacher. Mm-hmm. And I mean, clearly tutors and support help are very useful. I think they're overused, by the way, in the general population, along things like that. Like nobody's good at everything. And so I think what kids need is some confidence. How do they get confidence? Because you've noticed the things that they're good at and you've supported them and you're curious about it and you're interested and you listen. And I think I think there's more being asked of a kid with diversity. It's just like more intense, but it's the same thing that we all have to learn, which is, take pleasure in what your kid's good at and look at yourself. Were you great at everything? Probably not. And so why would you want your kid to do that? And if my parents had worried about my math scores, that meant I would have gotten a tutor, which was impossible in a working class family back then. But it would have taken the time away from reading and writing from me. So I was really glad they didn't. And I had mentioned my third kid had some reading issues. And to this day, if he was talking with me, he would tell me I made too much of a big deal out of it at the time. He's a lawyer now, so his language skills came in. Mm-hmm. They just came in really late. And I had to sit with that, with 2 other kids who were extremely, and I'm verbal. So learning to live with the child you have. Mm-hmm. I used to say whenever I spoke that we all have 2 children. We have the child we expected and the child we got.
Yes.
And, some people, there's alignment between that. And for a lot of people, they're very different pictures.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that is really at the heart of everything that I do within this parenting community is like learning to uncover all your own, like our own baggage or expectations or ideas or visions for what this should look like, or we thought it would look like, and just really focusing on the child that we have. And that is life's work right there.
That's right. It's sort of like when I started out, I always said, see the child in front of you. You have all kinds of ideas of who that child's supposed to be. And to the extent to which you can't let go of that and try and mold the child in that way, you've done a huge disservice to the incredible authenticity of every child. And I think you know what? I think you miss the pleasure of, if you're disappointed in the fact that your kid doesn't control himself so well, and, sensory stuff bothers him and they sort of blow up. If you're disappointed in that, you miss part of the best part of parenting, which is the uniqueness of what's standing in front of you and your relationship to that. So there's a lot for us to learn as parents in that. There's just a lot to learn. I remember my youngest kid, who was not a great student, wanted to be a fireman. And my history is my dad was a cop. My husband's a doctor, a surgeon. I want one of my kids should be a doctor, not a fireman like my dad was. That was a hard life. And this is the one who became a lawyer ultimately. But there were years where that's what he wanted to do. And I had to learn, and that's my background, to see that in an absolutely wonderful, positive, interesting way, which meant a lot of why questions instead of what. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Why do you think that would be? Why do you think that's a good way to live your life? Why do you think you would stay interested in that? Just lots of why questions.
I would say, too, just one thing to add, I think about this a lot, that differently wired children demand more of us as parents because we often have to be more like in the thick of it, advocating, understanding, how their brain works on a more detailed level than a parent of a neurotypical child would. And to me, that is a gift, if we can kind of lean into that and see, wow, this actually, it might seem more challenging, but it also can create deeper connection sometimes, or push us to really grow in ways that we weren't expecting to.
I think it's interesting. There's always this choice about which side you're going to see things on, so is it, oh, that's awful, I'm sorry, or is it, what a great opportunity to expand your parenting skills and expand your capacity for self-reflection. I think you do better if you fall on the side of opportunity. And the one thing I do wonder about after thinking about this some more is how parents with neurodiverse kids refuel. If you have a kid who's less demanding, you refuel by going in your room, or getting your nails done, or going for a walk. But, I'm curious to hear from you in this conversation. Like, what are the ways in which, people in your situation, parents like you, can extract themselves so that they can revive themselves?
We'll be right back after this quick break. Hey there, it's Debbie. I love making this show and sharing conversations about how to support our awesome neurodivergent kids. I've seen how even one little insight from an interview can spark a big shift in daily life. But I know that raising complex kids can be messy and lonely. And just when we think we figured it out, something comes up that boots us right back to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. That's why I've poured everything into creating a way for parents like us navigating complex parenting journeys to join together and chart a path that feels positive, hopeful, and doable. It's the brand new Differently Wired Club experience. In the club, you'll get personal support from me and other seasoned parent coaches, 6 live calls every month where you can connect and get your personal questions answered, the opportunity to learn directly from authors and experts like I have on this show, monthly themes for getting specific and tactical, an exclusive private podcast feed, and the best, most generous community of parents. Seriously, these folks show up for themselves and each other, and that right there is really everything. Because it's a daily reminder that we're not alone. Our kids aren't broken, and we have totally got this. The recently rebooted Differently Wired Club is on a brand new platform with its very own iOS and Android app. It is such a great space. However you learn, whatever your style, no matter the ages, genders, and neurodivergent profile of your children, the Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Join us today by going to tiltparenting.com/club. That's tiltparenting.com/club. I hope to see you on the inside.
If you're a parent, I invite you to join us at the Mindful Mama podcast, where it's all about becoming a less irritable, more joyful parent. With sometimes hilarious and always thought-provoking experts and friends, at Mindful Mama, we know that you cannot give what you do not have. And when you have calm and peace within, then you can give it to your children. I'm Hunter Clark-Fields, and I can't wait to see you there. Listen in to the Mindful Mama podcast.
Well, I don't know if you know this, Madeline, but I am really big into self-care, and I talk about it as these little small moments. And certainly it's harder when our kids are younger, because it can be harder to even find someone to watch your child. So you can't just necessarily send them across the street to the friend's house, And so there are a lot of parents who take advantage or try to find respite care just so they can have an hour to themselves to go grab a coffee and get kind of clear their heads. And certainly community, like leaning on community and having your team of people that you can reach out to and share, vent, do whatever you need to do to kind of work through that emotion. But yeah, it's challenging. And as I say all the time, it isn't an optional kind of a thing. Like, it has to be a priority. And so I really encourage people. For me, like, I'm a podcast listener, not just a maker podcast, but I consume podcasts. I'm a runner. I listen to podcasts while I'm cooking. That to me is self-care right there. I find ways to weave in things that I know fill me up in different ways into everyday life. So,
right.
So that's what I do.
And your point is well taken, that for everybody who has really young kids, your time is hard to come by. And so to the extent to which you can structure or normalize small things, although I do not consider your baking a small thing, to all your listeners, Debbie is the best baker in the world.
Oh, you're so funny.
Yeah. So everybody thinks like self-care is Canyon Ranch or going away.
I wish it was, but it's not that for me.
Right. And that's a one-off thing. But if you don't sort of wend something into your daily life, I think it's exhausting. And I don't know what I found through this. I'm a very unstructured person, and I write at 2 a.m, and that's just when you have 3 kids, you find ways to find time for yourself. But I found actually that structure helped me through the pandemic, which I had never had before. And now if you try and take away my morning cup of coffee, whoa, no, that won't work. It's sort of like learning the value of a little bit of structure around taking care of myself. Half hour has really been good. So, all the people who say structure is important, like Mark Kelly, the astronaut senator, who talked about being in outer space and how he would have gone crazy if the day wasn't totally structured. So, those are the kinds of things you learned through this pandemic, because I didn't have to be at the airport. And so I had time to think about things like that. I think it's going to take a lot. You said fixed mindset. That's a bad thing to have right now, because it's exactly the opposite of what people are going to need to get through this period. You're going to have to believe that you can do this. You're going to have to believe that you can change, that your child can change, that education will change, that hiring will change, or else you become fossilized in an expired paradigm that really, nothing could be clearer than what we just lived through. That flexibility and risk-taking and adaptability and resilience, all those things made this possible.
Mm-hmm. And we've all done it. I mean, certainly, it has been ugly, and there have been lots of very serious mental health challenges faced by a lot of kids.
Mm-hmm.
But most kids have adapted. They have adjusted.
That's
they
right.
are doing it. And that's
right.
something I don't remember. Some guest I had helped me kind of reframe, not to just say that we can do hard things, but we are doing something really hard.
Right. And I have a thing about brave families, and I think bravery is critical. And what is bravery? It's the willingness to confront challenge. It's not to hide. It's not to get into your squirrely places. It's to confront challenge. And I do think one of the outcomes of this for kids will be, I made it through. I got through. I know how to do that. In the same way that, how do kids learn anything? Like the baby, they got to fall down first. And, you see the exuberance of a child when they take those first steps, like the world has been handed to them. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of kids, I think there are a lot of problems. I don't want to downplay that. I think there really are a lot of problems. But I also think we have a whole generation of kids, many of whom have made this through intact and have every reason to be proud. And their parents have every reason to be proud of that fact. And that will be a story. I mean, one of the things I would like people to do is to write their story. Mm-hmm. Generations from now, this is going to be in the history books for sure, right? Mm-hmm. The political, the social justice, the pandemic. I mean, it's just a confluence of things. And what's your story going to be? How are you going to tell? What's your narrative about how you got through this, what was hard, what you learned? Mm-hmm. I think that's a good thing to do.
I agree. So in your book, you refer to hope and optimism as the ultimate life skills. This is something I'm just thinking a lot about and hearing a lot about and reading a lot about. And so I'm just wondering what you see as maybe some of the most powerful ways that parents and caregivers can help foster a sense of optimism and hope in our kids, again, having been through such a disruptive time.
So I think I told you I was an anxious mom. So I was always saying to my kids, "Are you okay?" Whatever they would do, "Are you okay?" That was my go-to response. And I think it was Michael. One of my kids pointed out to me, like, "Why are you always saying that? Like, we're fine." And so then I started thinking about the alternative to that, which is, "You're fine," or "I think you can do this," or "You've got this," or, and I think that language change is an important one. The kind of hovering, anxious, "Is everything okay? You okay?" I don't think serves kids, and I think sets up a mindset around the world is dangerous. You got to pay attention to stuff. You're always in danger of being hurt. This is for all you anxious moms out there. Switch it from "Are you okay?" to "You've got this," because most of the times kids do have it, and if they don't, then you can come in and be helpful. But like, I have a whole section in the book on accumulated disability. How when we push our hypervigilance and hyperparenting, we make our kids very risk averse. And this is not the time to have kids who shy away from challenge or risk, whatever you want to call it. So I think having a positive attitude yourself. On a personal note, I'm a pessimist. I have read every book on optimism. I have every book on Cultivating. Seligman, he's a positive psychologist. Mm-hmm. Has it moved my needle? Not very much, but I'll tell you what did. Becoming closer, better friends with a couple of people who are profoundly optimistic. Mm. And so every time I would say something in my usual little bit of darkness, they would say, "But Madeline, look at it the other way." And that has profoundly changed me. So, seek it out and then bring it into your home. It was nice to have people who were so positive. I can always find, people who think there are all kinds of problems, but it was very refreshing for me to have close friends who are optimists.
My son and I have been researching Martin Seligman's work and looking into a positive psychology course on Coursera to just see what we can do to cultivate more of that. Yeah. So super interesting. And also, I just to share, as you're talking about this, my husband is the one who's always like, be careful, be careful. I mean, I'm like 16 is my kid, but, tripping on something, be careful. And I think I just made the connection that that's an anxiety response. Sure. Really connected. I was just like, why are you saying that? Now I get it. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So let me just ask one last question then. As we, as this airs, we're going to be moving back into school, whatever life looks like. And I'm sure you're getting asked this all the time, like any word of advice or something that we might want to bear in mind in order to best support our kids for a transition back into school.
So I've been a psychologist for almost 40 years, which makes me like ancient. And I have never, ever had a kid in my office say, my parents just listen too much. Never. They always say my parents talk too much. And my advice for parents now, such as it is listen. What you and your child, and if you have a partner, other children are going through should be a source of tremendous curiosity. Tell me about going back to school. What was it like? Not what tests did you get, not how'd you do, not what party did you get. What was interesting about today? What did you learn about today? What was hard about today? Stuff that's been around for Rose and Thorn and those kinds of things that have been around forever. I think the biggest thing is check in with your own level of anxiety because, there's a boatload of research on your level of anxiety is contagious, basically. So you got to be sure you're okay. Some kids are thrilled to be going back to school. Some kids are terrified to be going back to school. Some kids benefited from distance learning. Some kids didn't. You've had the opportunity to get to know your kids a little bit better, hopefully through this period of time. They're not the same. They're going to have different kinds of reactions. And you're just curious to start with about how they're reacting, and your own anxiety is under control.
What a great intention to set. And I love that you use the word curious. It is my favorite word. And I think when we can show up with curiosity without an agenda, that is really serving our kids well.
Anxiety gets in the way of curiosity. Like what happens? I mean, I'll have to think about this, but when we're not curious, and I'm saying that's a really important thing, both for our kids going back to school, but in general for the world. What keeps us from being curious? We're afraid of the answer. We're afraid our kid might say, it's terrible. I hate it. I feel like killing myself. Or our kid might say, I'm so glad to be out of here. I can't stand hanging out with you guys anymore. I mean, I think it's always about anxiety. And to the extent to which we can hold that and hold an open point of view about our kids being different, having different experiences, changing over time, I think we serve our kids better.
What a wonderful way to close out this conversation. Thank you. Listeners, again, Madeline's book is Ready or Not, Preparing Our Kids to Thrive in an Uncertain and Rapidly Changing World. And thank you again. Thanks for writing this book. Is there another book or are you done?
Well, I thought I was done, but I am sort of taken with these myths that people have. And if I write again, that's what I might think about, but not right now.
Okay. All right. Well, you'll keep us posted and
I will
have you back on if you write that book. But thank you so much. It was great to see you and thanks for the conversation.
Sure. Bye.
You've been listening to the Tilt Parenting Podcast. You can find links to all the resources my guests and I discussed on the detailed show notes page. Just go to tiltparenting.com/podcast and select this episode. If you love this podcast and want to help cover the cost of its production, please consider joining my Patreon campaign. For as little as $2 a month, you can help cover the cost of the hosting platform, editing, production, and more. Just go to patreon.com/tiltparenting to learn more. Lastly, please help this podcast stay visible and easily found by subscribing and leaving a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks so much for considering. And that's all for this week. Stay safe, stay well, and take good care. And for more information on Tilt Parenting, visit www.tiltparenting.com.
Hey, are you a parent of a teenager? Are you feeling overwhelmed about how to be what they need while also holding limits and boundaries that keep them safe? Are you tired of conversations that negate how messy this season of parenting is? Well, I've got you. My name is Casey O'Rourke. I am a positive discipline trainer, parent coach, and the host of the Joyful Courage podcast. Every week, I come to you with an interview digging into tough topics with experts I trust and solo shows that go deep into the personal growth and mindset needed to raise teens in a way that grows them into confident, capable young people. I am not afraid of getting real about the intersection of conscious parenting and the teen years, while also bringing in vulnerability, humor, and lightness. I'm walking the path with you and honored to serve. Listen to Joyful Courage on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you consume podcasts.